When it comes to science, there's a bit of a hidden curriculum that emphasizes the need for scientists to focus on evidence and be dispassionate and objective in their reporting of their findings. Yet, when it comes to communication, we really emphasize subjectivity, interpersonal relationships, and emotions. And with traditional scientific training, those skills are not really emphasized, but they can be really, really important. So let's take a look at a historical example. In 1848, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who was in an accident and had a pole go through his head. It punctured his left frontal lobe, which is known as the emotional hub of the brain. And remarkably, he survived. But when it came to any sort of human interaction or decision making, he couldn't do it. It really is an example of how emotions are essential when it comes to reasoning and decision making. And this is important when we think about our lives today. When it comes to reasoning and decision making, we humans are what are called cognitive misers. We essentially have limited resources. And so it's really impossible for us to pay attention to everything that comes our way, right? We live in this fast-moving society where we're constantly inundated with messages. And so we try to create the maximum outcome with the least amount of work possible. And in that process, we often rely on heuristics. Heuristics are kind of these if-then statements. If something happens, then I will do this. So for example, if I see like a Nike swoosh on a sweatshirt, that may trigger a quality heuristic for me, or maybe a popularity heuristic for me. And that allows me to make some connections without much effort, without much cognitive effort. The problem with heuristics is they don't always stick as well as just deep, thoughtful processing. And so if we're trying to engage people to really have deep thought, then we need to think about who our audiences are and what sort of messages they may respond to. When it comes to science communication, there are many different audiences that we may engage with. Our science researcher peers, administrators, funders, policymakers, and importantly, the general public. So we want to think about who our audience is and what's going to motivate them to listen to you and understand the information that's presented to you. As scientists, we want to think about what are the personal influences of our audiences and maybe how we could frame the information that we're presenting to them. When it comes to framing, it's not so much about what you say, but how you say it. What sort of information are you including or excluding in your frame? And so we think about that presentation. When we talk about frames, there are kind of two key approaches. The first is emphasis framing. This is where we have the same issue, but we have different presentations of the issue. So for example, if I'm talking about COVID-19, I may present it with a health frame or maybe a safety frame. And that can help me to knowing where my audience is and what their motivations are, maybe tap into maybe their understanding of like disease risk for a health frame to make it that much more impactful. The other approach to framing is called equivalence framing. And that's where you have the same content, but there's a slightly different approach. The example of, is a glass half full or half empty? Or is your yogurt 99% fat-free or 1% fat? They're the same things, but we're using language and framing to have different meaning. Emotions, too, are really important when it comes to framing because frames can be a way to really ignite different emotions in individuals to influence their attitudes and behaviors. So you can think about how maybe I could instill hope for the future of microbiology, or maybe anger about developments in artificial intelligence. And that can influence how people respond in the decisions that they make. And importantly, when it comes to emotions and frames, they're not necessarily correct or incorrect, like we may say with knowledge. Everyone is going to respond to a frame in a different way. They're very unique responses. So it's important if you're using emotions and frames to consider, be intentional with your actions and consider what the ethical implications are of those work. Finally, when it comes to traditional science communication training, there really is this focus on information and knowledge transfer, and not really this emphasis on emotion and frames. But they're all really connected, and so to be really impactful, this is an area that science communicators should really develop. What are some examples you've seen in pop culture? For example, what does it mean when you see Taylor Swift's face associated with a product? Leave some examples in the comments below.